Meanwhile, our monthly check-in with Representative Dave Maturen happens right now in April. Hi there, Dave. Good morning.
Morning. Happy to be here.
Thanks for being back with us today. So I guess the big thing right now, as it is pretty often at this time of the year, is trying to sort out how we're going to spend our money in the coming year.
Well, the budget essentially is a statement of priorities for the governor, Senate, and the House.
Right, and so this do-si-do thing that goes on here is just about to get started.
Right, it is, and I think both the Senate and the House have come in roughly 270 million less than what the governor's come in at. So we'll see when we're going to be talking about it further this week, more in depth. I'm not on appropriations, but looking forward to the discussions, and then we'll see what gets passed out of both chambers, and then the negotiations for the governor's office starts.
Right, and coming up on Friday, Representative Bison will be here, and I believe he is on appropriations.
He is, yes.
And so I'm sure whatever happens between now and then, he'll have an update on that.
Should be more information.
Yeah. Anything impressing you about how this has come together so far?
Again, I haven't been involved in the process yet. Sit on the policy side of the House representatives. I think the biggest cut is Health and Human Services, about $120 million. Pretty substantial cut. I'd be curious to see exactly where all of the kind of the devil's in the details.
Right. Yeah. And when we talked with Dr. Bison last month, that part was still being hammered out. So he was headlong into that.
Right. Yeah, that was the last piece of the budget. Obviously, the biggest part of the budget, and last piece to get finalized, at least as far as the committee goes.
Mm-hmm. All right, and a number of other things on the priority list to talk about. You're on the Tax Policy Committee, and we'll get to what's going on there. And House and Senate both recently approving bills as it relates to special needs children, and we'll get to that too. And we'll talk a little about the Natural Resources Committee, on which you're a participant as well, and we'll get to that too. And maybe you have a question as well for Representative Dave Maturen today at 441-9595. We'll try and work that in as well. 8:13, back in a moment on 95.3 WBCK. Representative Dave Maturen back with us here in April. You know, you're on the Tax Policy Committee, Vice Chair, in fact, and some of the discussions have been about brownfield redevelopment. There's been some bills out of the Senate recently. Of course, brownfields are not a new thing. There's been redevelopment efforts in that regard for some time. But what's new here, Dave?
Well, this is called a transformational tax increment finance, transformational TIF, brownfield. Mm-hmm. The typical brownfield allows for the capture of the property taxes that go into that development to pay for the infrastructure needs, cleanup of that development. The transformational TIF, it's Senate Bills 111 through 115 or so. It allows for really properties that are just really extremely expensive to develop.
I see.
And it allows them to capture the sales, the income tax that goes on in that development. So if it's a residential, has a residential component, it would capture the income taxes of those people that live there. And if it's in any business activity, it would capture that income tax. It would only capture to the point where they need to fill a gap. And the developer himself, herself, would put major amounts of money. You're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in the case of the kind of the redevelopment of the old Hudson's facility down there in downtown Detroit. Mm-hmm. So hundreds of millions of dollars up front. The market level for rents and things just wouldn't justify that. So there's a gap, and allows the developer to fill that gap. It's generally, it's barely put in place for properties that are really extremely expensive to redevelop, properties where you got tens and maybe hundreds of millions of dollars just to get the place cleaned up and foundations and everything else put in. And some people look at it as corporate welfare, and other folks look at it as, this is something that's needed. After they fill that gap, then the state of Michigan would collect its normal revenues from the income tax. I think it's a worthwhile thing. It's some areas you really need that additional boost to get this done, and redeveloping old central cities and polluted sites and sites that have been unused for decades, I think it's certainly worthwhile.
Now, in some cases, those properties are owned, are they not? And so they might be on the tax rolls, or is it fair to say that most of them are not?
Well, I mean, they're owned by someone, could be a land bank or whatever.
Right.
But the taxes they're getting from basically a defunct factory or a contaminated site are virtually nil.
Yeah.
After these sit here for decades, somebody's got to come in and do it. And again, it's to allow them to just fill that gap. There's a tremendous amount of money that's already put up front. There's no upfront money per se. It's not like a we kind of end up getting hung up on these mega grants that come back to haunt the state of Michigan. Our corporate income tax was negative last year because of all the negative the mega credits that get cashed in. So it's not that kind of a program. A lot of money up front by the developer, but there's a gap between the market rents and stuff you can charge and the cost to develop these properties.
Well, if you think about the example you used, the Hudson's building, I mean, if you replace that with retail and office and residential spaces, now you're talking about property that has value, and the tax collection from those properties is going to be significant.
Right, and not only that, but you're obviously doing something for the neighborhood. You're taking an eyesore, which really infects just about everything around it.
Yep.
And now you've got a nice, property that's generating income. That's, hopefully you're putting something in there to be an attraction to the rest of the community. So, there's nothing wrong with somebody doing well by doing good. And I think in these instances where these properties have been sitting there for a long, long time, it's going to take that extra boost. Obviously, it passed the Senate in pretty good shape, and we've had two hour-and-a-half long hearings so far in House tax policy, and I guess we're waiting to see what Chair Tedder wants to do with either more testimony or a vote. Lots of folks from chambers of commerce all over the state came in last time to testify. Derek Knopf from Southwest Michigan First was there, so a lot of support for that particular effort.
All right, Representative Dave Maturen is here. A few more minutes with him in just a moment. 95.3 WBCK. We're here with Representative Dave Maturen. A few more minutes. I didn't read the details yet of this article, but I saw it fly by on M Live about auto insurance in Michigan, that there's a proposal to lower it in Detroit, and it might have the opposite effect outstate. And we were talking with Mackinac Center for Public Policy recently, and their primer that's been issued is, our no-fault system is one of the most expensive in the country, and it really is a failure. Is there any talk at all that you've heard in the House about addressing this at all, or looking at it at all, or is it not advantageous politically at this point?
Well, I'm sure it'll come up. Obviously, we do have high auto insurance rates. From what I understand, and I'm not on the insurance committee, from what I understand, half the people in Detroit don't have insurance.
That's where some of the cost comes in.
Simply because they can't afford it.
Yeah.
The rates are phenomenal, and so folks take their chances, and we all end up paying for a lot of that to begin with. You've got the catastrophic claims. Michigan is the only state in the country where your claims, if you're injured in an auto accident, are unlimited. Some people think that's a good thing. Other people say, why shouldn't we be like other states? However, that's probably about 10% of what the auto insurance bill is for lots of folks. So we're looking at about $180 a year, Catastrophic Claims Association. And it's interesting because that's a state mandate to participate in that, and yet the books are private books.
Yeah.
And there was a case last year, I believe it didn't go anywhere, asking the courts to open up the Catastrophic Claims Association so folks can see exactly what's happened in the money there. Again, that's a whole other issue, but it is a portion of a relatively high insurance bill for folks driving in Michigan. So, and the Detroit issue, I kind of saw the same headlines you did, kind of flash by. Mayor Duggan's got some ideas for it, whether it's a special policy for folks, whether maybe they can accept less unlimited coverage if that's the issue. Again, it's been debated since I've been in the House and before that, and we'll see where it all ends up. But obviously, it does hit people in the pocketbook.
Right. All right. We spend a fair amount of time each week talking with the folks at Miles for Memories, and they came up with a program that allows the families of those who have dementia to register with local authorities in case they become lost. Then if a law enforcement officer were to encounter them, it would be easier for them to figure out where they should be. What you've been working on with something called the volunteer registry with fingerprints and photographs of special needs children. It's kind of along the same lines.
Yeah, it wasn't really nothing came before my committee, but certainly something that I supported. And it just allows you, if you have a child with special needs, that sometimes if they wander away, they're not verbal, it allows you to go ahead on your own volition and register their fingerprints in a photo. So if the law enforcement agencies do find somebody and they can't quite communicate with them, they can take their fingerprint. They can, within a relatively short period of time, figure out who they are and get in contact with the parents or whoever may be their caretakers. So
the governor's probably going to sign that.
I would think so. Yeah. It's just a common sense thing to do. Makes all the sense in the world to me. So, and
it's voluntary. So if you don't want to, you don't have to. Yeah. All right. Natural Resources Committee has been talking about copper mines lately.
Well, there's native copper. It really only occurs in a few spots in the Upper Peninsula, and they're small mines. There was a fair amount of discussion. Should they go through the normal rules and regulations that a much larger mine would go through, or are these such a small nature, generally already in an existing mine, that they still go through a permitting process, but it's not as expensive, not as horrendous a task as getting an approval for a much larger mine. So it's something that the folks from the UP, the entire delegation up there is behind. I said on Natural Resources Committee this year, I thought it was a reasonable accommodation for people who want to mine that natural copper, of which there's not a whole lot. And again, they're relatively small operations, minimal risk to the environment, if any. So,
when you were here in March, you talked a little bit about the idea that federal money that would go toward Great Lakes programs is threatened right now, and I noticed some other media picked up on it after you were here. Anything new on that front?
No, we're still, I represent the state of Michigan on the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus on the Executive Committee. We put together a resolution to the President, to our congressional delegation, signed by many members from the 8 states that border the Great Lakes, the 2 Canadian provinces that I don't think the President was going to listen to the Canadians, so they didn't sign on. But we also have another issue now. It's called the, it's a study the Corps of Engineers did on Asian carp. And that was supposed to be released, I believe, in February, and now the administration is kind of hanging on to that. So we're looking at another letter, another resolution to the federal government saying, please release a study. They've been working on it since 2015. Federal tax dollars paid for it. We'd like to see exactly what the Corps of Engineers' recommendation is for attempting to find a solution to keep the Asian carp out of the Great Lakes. So a couple of issues, both dealing with the administration, and I know our delegation is the Michigan delegation is firmly behind the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, maintaining that money there. It's grant money to allow people to piggyback on that money and go ahead and rejuvenate polluted sites, things like that affect the Great Lakes. It's a national treasure, not just a Midwest treasure.
Right,
so.
Right. And we presume that whatever that Asian carp report is could have a bearing on the positions that you've taken as it relates to the Great Lakes funding.
Absolutely right. I mean, we need to know. I mean, there should be a method by which we keep those carp out of the Great Lakes, and they're starting to find some DNA samples. So that's not a positive thing. Once they get in, it's just one more major invasive species that could really wreak havoc on the Great Lakes fishery. Economic issues would be tremendous for the Great Lakes.
Mm-hmm. All right. Representative Dave Maturen checks in once a month with us here on the program. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
All right. We'll stay in touch.